To think you know the Caliphates, those golden empires of Islam that spread faith, science, and culture across continents? Well, buckle up, because the real story is far darker than the history books dare to tell you. Behind the marble palaces and the call to prayer, there were secrets so forbidden that chroniclers buried them and clerics cursed them. Powerful rulers who thundered about morality by day, but indulged in pleasures by night that defied their own laws. Eunuchs who became the silent gatekeepers of sin. Poets who mocked religion with verses of wine and boys, their words so scandalous they still shock the world 1,000 years later. This wasn't whispered rumor. It was lived reality. Smooth-faced attendants dressed in silks finer than any queen's, bathhouses where steam blurred sin into ritual, taverns where wine and desire flowed more freely than water. And at the center of it all, caliphs whose forbidden desires risked not just their souls, but the stability of entire dynasties. You're about to discover the shocking curiosities of the Islamic caliphates that make today's scandals look tame. From Gilman trained to serve as living ornaments to poetry so bold it could topple thrones, from laws that thundered punishment but fell silent at court, to whispers of scandals that could bring down empires. These are the truths history tried to erase. And once you hear them, you'll never see the caliphates the same way again. The city sleeps under a silver moon, but the palace is alive with whispers. Torches flicker against marble walls, shadows stretch across mosaic floors, and servants scurry through corridors carrying trays of spiced wine. Beyond the golden doors of the caliph's chamber, the most powerful man in the Islamic world reclines on cushions embroidered with pearls. His court poets call him the defender of faith, the sword of God, the shadow of Allah on earth. But here, in the velvet-draped silence of night, he is something else entirely. The official chronicles praise his victories, his generosity, his devotion to prayer. They never speak of the boys. Smooth-faced attendants with perfumed hair, their eyes lowered as they pour his drink or fan his brow. They are not wives locked in harems, nor concubines brought from distant lands. They are something more forbidden, more dangerous. And yet their presence is undeniable. Behind the caliph's curtain lies a truth that chroniclers dared not write, but poets hinted at and gossip clung to like smoke. Desire that defied the rules of men, love that risked eternal damnation, lust that could topple dynasties. History has been scrubbed clean for centuries, repainted in piety and honor. But the walls of these palaces once trembled with the same human hungers we recognize today. And in the Islamic Golden Age, those hungers did not always follow the lines laid down by law. What if the men hailed as God's chosen rulers carried within their hearts and their beds the very sins their jurists condemned? That question lingers like the scent of oud in the empty halls, daring us to pull back the curtain and face a truth both shocking and undeniable. They were neither men nor women, but something in between. Eunuchs, men stripped of their manhood, bound forever to lives of service in the palaces of the caliphs. They patrolled the harem doors, guarded treasures, and whispered instructions to slaves. But more than guards or servants, they were shadows in human form, always present, always watching, and always silent. For centuries, eunuchs stood at the threshold of the most intimate secrets of the caliphs. They were the ones who led beautiful young boys into private chambers, the ones who turned their eyes away when the curtains closed. They became the intermediaries between desire and discretion. If anyone knew the truth of what unfolded behind silk screens, it was them. Yet their voices are missing from history. They did not write chronicles. They did not leave memoirs. Their testimony is scattered only in fragments, in off-handed mentions of their power and influence. But silence itself can speak volumes. The very reason eunuchs were entrusted with such roles was because they could not threaten bloodlines, could not father heirs, could not rival the caliph's authority. They were both trusted and expendable, loyal by necessity, witnesses by design. In some courts, eunuchs became confidants, wielding influence far beyond their station, for they knew what others could only guess. And in rare, whispered accounts, they became participants too, filling roles that blurred the lines between servitude and intimacy. The eunuch's presence reveals a chilling truth. The forbidden practices of the Caliphate were not carried out in isolation, but required an entire infrastructure of silence. The eunuchs were the walls with ears, the invisible witnesses of pleasures that the law forbade but power permitted. They remind us that history is often written not by what was said, but by what had to remain unspoken. The court was a place of law, faith, and ceremony by day. But at night, it belonged to the poets. Their verses were not sermons, they were confessions disguised as art. In the bustling heart of Baghdad, one name rose above all others, Abu Nuwas. To the pious, he was a scandal. To the powerful, he was entertainment. To history, he became the poet of forbidden truths. Abu Nuwas wrote not in whispers but in bold proclamations, weaving verses of wine, pleasure, and boys with faces as soft as moonlight. His poetry celebrated forbidden intimacy with a candor that still startles modern readers. Descriptions of cheeks like roses, lips stained with pomegranate, and young men whose beauty rivaled maidens. These were not metaphors buried in obscurity. They were naked declarations of desire that the caliphs themselves laughed at, recited, and sometimes lived out. What makes this shocking is not only the content but the context. In a civilization that outwardly condemned same-sex love as sinful, the most celebrated poet of the Golden Age filled scroll after scroll with its praises, and was rewarded with wealth and patronage. His lines were recited in gardens as boys served wine, sung aloud in taverns as silk-robed men reclined on cushions, and preserved in manuscripts that somehow escaped erasure. The poetry reveals a dual reality. The law might forbid, but the heart and the pen found its own sanctuary. Abu Nuwas and others like him immortalized what official histories tried to silence, that behind the grandeur of Islamic scholarship and empire-building lay a culture unafraid to taste forbidden fruit. In their rhymes, the caliph's secret pleasures were not condemned, but glorified. And poetry, more than law, became the true confessor of the age. They were called gilman, boys bought, trained, and adorned for service in the palaces of the mighty. To outsiders, they were attendants, cupbearers, musicians, and dancers. To those who dared look closer, they were something else entirely. Living luxuries, possessions of flesh and blood, whose beauty was as prized as gold. The caliphs and governors selected these boys for their youth, their smooth skin, their feminine grace. They were dressed in silks finer than many nobles wore, perfumed with rosewater, their eyes painted with kohl to make them resemble the maidens of paradise. At feasts, they poured wine into jeweled goblets, their soft laughter mingling with the music of lutes. But when the banquet ended and the candles burned low, their role often shifted. They were led into chambers where their service was no longer public performance, but private submission. The contradiction is staggering. Islam's jurists thundered against sodomy, declaring it a crime against God's order. Yet in the heart of the empire, its most powerful men surrounded themselves with boys who were objects of both desire and dominance. Some gilman rose to favor, becoming companions, confidants, even lovers of rulers. Others remained nameless, their beauty consumed like wine, discarded when age stole their charm. What makes their story more unsettling is the absence of choice. These were not romances of equals, but transactions of power. The boys were slaves, bought, owned, and commanded. Their beauty was currency, their bodies commodities. They embodied both opulence and oppression, the pinnacle of luxury and the deepest form of bondage. In the glittering palaces of the caliphs, these boys stood as living contradictions, forbidden yet flaunted, condemned yet celebrated. They were the unspoken proof that desire does not bow to doctrine, and that power often writes its own laws behind closed doors. In the world of the caliphs, sex was never just sex. It was power, raw, undeniable, and often cruel. To be the dominant partner was to assert authority. To be made submissive was to be humiliated, feminized, and stripped of dignity. This wasn't whispered morality. It was politics played out in bedchambers. The caliphs, viziers, and governors often wielded desire like a weapon. A beautiful ghulam wasn't just entertainment. He was a trophy, a display of wealth and dominance. Rumors spread of rulers who neglected their wives for the company of boys, of generals who flaunted their favorites at court banquets. To take pleasure in a slave boy was to demonstrate that no law, no tradition, no cleric could limit a man whose power rivaled kingship itself. But this dominance carried a dangerous edge. A caliph could embrace a boy openly, but if a man of lower rank was rumored to submit, the shame was ruinous. The roles mattered more than the act. The active partner was still seen as masculine, untouchable. The passive partner was mocked as effeminate, weak, unworthy of respect. Thus, the palace became a paradox, a place where homosexual practices flourished, but always under the strict hierarchy of who conquered and who was conquered. The irony was bitter. What was forbidden by law became acceptable in practice if you held enough power. What could destroy an ordinary man's honor became a caliph's privilege. And so the palace halls, lined with Quranic inscriptions and pious calligraphy, also echoed with the laughter of wine-drunk poets, the shuffle of silk slippers, and the moans of boys who embodied the empire's most dangerous contradiction: forbidden pleasure as the highest luxury of power. For a faith so deeply rooted in rules, early Islamic law was strangely quiet about one of history's most explosive taboos. The Quran thundered against the people of Lot, describing their destruction as punishment for obscene acts. Jurists debated the meaning, scholars wrote long treatises, and clerics issued fatwas. Yet the legal codes of the Caliphates were riddled with ambiguity. Some texts demanded death for sodomy, equating it to adultery. Others prescribed flogging, exile, or humiliation. But just as often, the law fell silent, leaving vague references that could be ignored or manipulated. In many regions, enforcement was inconsistent. One judge condemned men to death, another turned a blind eye, and another laughed off the rumors entirely. The silence was not accidental. Power had its hand in shaping morality. Caliphs who surrounded themselves with ghilman were hardly eager to enforce strict prohibitions. Judges who lived off palace patronage knew when to look away. And so, the law existed on paper, but the practice thrived in shadows, condemned in sermons, celebrated in poetry, and tolerated in palaces. This duality left society in confusion. To the common man, the threat of punishment was real. A scandal in the bathhouse could mean lashes or worse. But in the golden halls of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, the same acts that could damn a peasant were indulged in by caliphs with impunity. The contradiction was glaring. An empire that called itself the guardian of divine law, yet tolerated forbidden desires at its highest levels. The silence of the law became its own answer. By not naming, by not enforcing consistently, the Caliphates created a hidden space where practice flourished in defiance of doctrine. And in that silence, the truth lived on, whispered through the centuries, too dangerous to declare, too widespread to erase. If the palace was the stage for power's forbidden pleasures, the streets of the Caliphates offered their own shadowy theaters. Beyond the minarets and mosques, in the narrow alleys of Baghdad and Cordoba, men sought out taverns where lamps glowed dim, wine flowed freely, and shame dissolved into laughter. Here, boys with painted eyes served goblets of forbidden drink and leaned close enough for whispers no imam dared to hear. The gardens were no less dangerous. Under pomegranate trees and beside bubbling fountains, poets and their companions gathered at night, hidden from the gaze of the faithful. The verses sung in these gatherings were not of prophets and martyrs, but of moon-faced youths, their cheeks compared to blossoms, their lips to roses heavy with dew. In the shadows of these orchards, hands touched, desires flared, and the line between friendship and love dissolved. Then there were the bathhouses, the hammams. Ostensibly places of cleansing and purity, they became the most notorious spaces for secret encounters. Steam rose thick enough to blur modesty, and beneath the vaulted domes, men shed not only their garments, but their restraint. The records of travelers and moralists alike speak of hammams as dens of temptation, where pleasure was bought, traded, and indulged beneath the hiss of hot water. These spaces reveal the truth. The forbidden was not hidden only in palaces, but woven into daily life. While clerics thundered from pulpits about morality, ordinary men were slipping into taverns, gardens, and hammams to chase desires, both whispered and sung. These places became sanctuaries of the flesh, pockets of freedom in a world ruled by law and fear. And in their secrecy, they proved that desire is far older and stronger than doctrine. The jurists never stopped trying to fight it. From pulpits and prayer halls, they thundered warnings. Those who commit the sin of Lot shall face God's wrath. Fatwas were issued, treatises written, and punishments devised, flogging, exile, even death. Yet even as the ink of condemnation dried, the realities of practice mocked the page. The scholars condemned, but the rulers indulged. The gap was glaring. What was denounced as a sin in sermons became an open secret in the caliph's court. So how was the contradiction maintained? Through cover-up, selective punishment, and careful silence. When a scandal erupted among commoners, 2 men caught in a bathhouse, for instance, the punishment was swift, meant to appease moral outrage. But when it was the caliph or his favorite boy, the chroniclers looked away. The same poets who immortalized the beauty of boys also depended on court patronage. To write too directly was dangerous, to hint was acceptable. And so the hypocrisy flourished. Publicly, homosexuality was a crime. Privately, it was entertainment, luxury, even a currency of influence. Religious scholars became complicit by omission, turning their fury toward powerless offenders while sparing the hands that fed them. Meanwhile, the masses lived in fear of exposure, while the elite wrapped their desires in silk and poetry. This selective condemnation created a society that knew but never admitted, saw but never recorded. The cover-up was not an accident. It was a necessity. Without it, the Caliphate's image of piety and divine authority would collapse. The silence, the denials, the scapegoating of the powerless all served one purpose: to protect the illusion that the rulers were guardians of morality, even as they indulged in its forbidden opposite. In the glittering courts of the caliphs, whispers could kill. A single rumor, carried on the breath of rivals, could topple viziers, stain princes, and shake the very foundations of dynasties. And when those whispers concerned forbidden desires, they spread like wildfire. Chroniclers record tales of caliphs mocked by enemies for loving boys more than their wives. One Abbasid ruler was accused of doting so openly on his ghulam that his legitimacy was questioned in sermons. A vizier, too close to a handsome attendant, found his rivals seizing on the scandal, using accusations of sodomy as a political weapon. Even princes, once heirs apparent, were quietly removed from succession when whispers of their affections became too loud to ignore. The stakes were enormous. A caliph was not just a man. He was the commander of the faithful, the shadow of God on earth. To accuse him of a forbidden love was to strike at the very soul of his authority. Thus, enemies used it mercilessly. In some cases, scandals were exaggerated, in others invented entirely, but the fear of exposure lingered in every chamber. And yet the irony was cruel. What was condemned in public was celebrated in private. Poets immortalized these very scandals in verse, singing of boys with faces that shamed the moon and of caliphs whose passion outshone their piety. These poems circulated like wildfire, thinly veiled truths disguised as art. Everyone knew, but few dared to say it aloud. In the Caliphates, desire was not just a personal sin. It was political dynamite. One rumor could ruin reputations, end careers, and rewrite history. And for those who indulged too openly, forbidden love became not just a private act of passion, but the spark that could set an empire ablaze. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, and the forbidden stories of the caliphs were slowly buried. Mosques replaced palaces, scholars rewrote chronicles, and the memory of boys in silks serving wine was scrubbed from respectable history. What remained was a sanitized tale of holy rulers and pious scholars, guardians of divine law unsullied by human weakness. But the truth was never fully erased. It lingers in the margins of manuscripts, in verses of poetry copied in secret, in travelers' accounts that describe bathhouses thick with temptation, in chronicles that hint at scandals too dangerous to name outright. The evidence is there, scattered like shards of broken glass across the desert sands. All it requires is the courage to piece it together. The silence of history is not innocent. It was crafted, maintained, and enforced. The jurists who thundered against sin, the chroniclers who omitted inconvenient truths, the conquerors who reshaped Islam's memory, all played their part in erasing the stories of forbidden love. Yet the tombs, the poetry, and the rumors refuse to vanish. They whisper still, daring us to listen. And that whisper is shocking. That the Caliphates, remembered as paragons of faith and morality, were also places where forbidden desires flourished in the very heart of power, where law condemned, but rulers indulged, where boys became both ornaments and victims, their beauty carved into poetry but erased from chronicles. The shocking truth beneath the sand is this: history is not pure. It is not the clean, pious narrative handed down in sermons and textbooks. It is human, messy, and often scandalous. And in the forbidden loves of the caliphs, we find not only hypocrisy, but also a reminder that power bends morality, that desire cannot be erased, and that behind the curtain of every empire lies a truth too dangerous to tell.